The law, of course, has to keep up with changes in technology. And one of the areas where we received a lot of feedback where you would want support from us is discussing the issues arising out of cloud and cloud computing. In this session, Sally will answer some of those questions. Sally, I'm over the age of 20, so I have no idea what the cloud's about. What exactly are cloud services?
Well, cloud services, Michael, it's a form of IT outsourcing, actually. So it's where instead of having your IT infrastructure in your building with all of your other assets and your people, you outsource it to a third party. And that's quite a usual form of dealing with IT functionality these days because lots of people do that. The difference here is, though, that you actually access your IT infrastructure through a web browser, so through the internet, effectively. And that might be through Internet Explorer, Google Chrome or Safari, some mechanism like that.
So why is cloud so popular?
Actually building your own IT infrastructure in-house is really quite expensive. And the beauty of cloud is that it's actually a lot cheaper mechanism for buying IT functionality. That's because in many cases it's multi-tenanted, so you're sharing IT with lots of other businesses, so you get economies of scale. The other aspect to it is it's actually really flexible, really scalable, so you can buy as little or as much of it as you want. And it's really quite easy to get going. It's got this sort of plug and play mechanism to it, so you can kind of log on, set up your passwords and you're ready to go. Contrast that, of course, with building an IT infrastructure in-house where you can take months and months to actually establish the system within your own building.
That sounds perfect, but we all know nothing's perfect. What are the downsides with the cloud and what issues arise?
I think the downsides are that because it is a relatively cheap service and people want to use it for lots of things, some of which are quite sensitive areas of their business, they expect quite a lot of contractual commitment from their supplier. But you have to look at this a bit from the cloud provider's perspective, because they're saying, well, we're not charging much for this, so we're not going to give you all of the usual contractual protections that you might expect in a different form of IT agreement. So you tend to get contracts that don't cover security that well, where you don't get very many guarantees about availability, and there's quite a lot of exclusions of liability from the perspective of the provider.
My guess is the cloud will hold a lot of data. What are the data protection issues of the cloud?
That's actually, interestingly, one of the really, really big concerns that most users have, because I've just said that cloud providers don't want to actually have a lot of liability in relation to the provision of this service because they see it as low margin. But contrast that, of course, if you're a user and you're storing your data in the cloud, you want to know that your cloud provider is going to take all the appropriate technical and organisational measures to ensure that that data is kept safe and secure. And of course, as a data controller under our UK legislation, you have quite a lot of liability and responsibility around that. Ordinarily in an IT outsourcing, the service provider would be quite happy to take on that responsibility. But again, cloud providers, because of the margins that they're making and because it's a multi-tenanted environment, are very, very reluctant to step up to the plate and take on the responsibility for all of their tenants in this platform's data, and they don't like to give that contractual responsibility. What you then have to do as a customer is make assessments about what the provider is doing and determine whether that's going to be sufficient to keep the data secure. And we are seeing deals not going ahead because of a disconnect between a provider and a user on this particular issue.
Is there anything we should be doing before we start heading off into the clouds?
Well, it's funny actually, because I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and we were commenting that quite often you can enter into an agreement for IT, or you can negotiate an agreement for IT as a lawyer without really understanding what the IT does. You might know it's a software license or a software application, and therefore you know the sort of contract you need. But actually, cloud is completely different because it's made up of lots of different layers, and there's lots of different ways of delivering a cloud service. That that means that some aspects of cloud are more risky than others. Unless you really understand what is going on in the cloud service, where the data is going to be located, where the relevant data centers are, you haven't got any chance really of being able to assess the balancing of the risk that I talked about before, because you're not going to get the contractual protection that you might want to get from the provider. So before you even start looking at a contract, it's absolutely essential that you understand the nature of the service, where the data centers are, who else is subcontracted in to provide that infrastructure, and all of those other issues. Look at the provider's security policy, get a feel for how good or bad that is. If you do all of that due diligence beforehand, you'll save yourself a lot of time later in the negotiation, and B, you'll realise fairly quickly whether this is a service that you're going to be able to buy, and it's a service that will be appropriate for your business.
I'd imagine you might sometimes want to change providers. What do you need to do?
There are two issues here really. One is an issue that we could talk about in terms of interoperability. So if you want to be able to move the service around or the data around, then you need to make sure that the service you initially buy is interoperable with other services. And of course you need to make sure it's interoperable with your own IT systems. And when I talk about interoperability in an IT sense, I just mean working together and being able to talk to each other. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is that you need to make sure that you build into your contract the right to get the data delivered to you in a format that is going to be compatible with other services. So that's a really important contractual provision that you need to include. And you also may need to include, because don't forget this is an IT outsourcing, some provisions around exit assistance and having the means to require that provider to help you with that exit out of one provider into another provider. So really I think the advice there is treat it like any other IT outsourcing where you would have some sort of exit provisions.
So if I want to get out of a cloud agreement, what are the termination issues?
But there's a couple of issues I think that are particularly important for a customer, and one of those relates to the right to be able to terminate for convenience. So what you might find is in long-term IT outsourcing agreements, you're limited in terms of your right to terminate for convenience. And if you do exercise that right, then you have to pay fairly hefty termination charges. Because of the point I made already about the fact that it's quite hard to get strong contractual terms from these cloud providers, especially around the quality of the service and the experience, the customer experience that you're going to have, it's really, really important, therefore, not to be locked in for a long period of time and to have the right to terminate. The other issue is that sometimes cloud providers reserve the right to be able to unilaterally change the terms and conditions or change the scope of the services or change, very importantly, the security aspects of the service. And if this happens, again, you really need to be able to get the right to terminate. You don't want to be locked into something that's completely different from what you originally bought.
Cloud sounds like some kind of software thingy. Do I need a software license?
In terms of accessing the cloud service, you don't really need a software license because you're actually not running software on your machines. You're just accessing it through the internet and you're utilising a service. Sometimes when you're using the service through an internet browser, you have to download plugins or extensions or software onto your own systems. So if you're being purist about it, then you probably would take a software license for those elements that are actually downloaded onto your system and you're running yourself. I don't think it's a big deal in the context of cloud, actually, and the more important point here is to be very clear about your access and use rights. Who can use it? Can you let your group companies use it? Can you let your service providers use it? Can you let your customers, in some case, use it? That's the more important point, I think, to cover.
To my mind, it sounds as if multi-tenanting will result in some kind of generic service. Is it possible to develop a specific platform for a specific client?
It depends on the sophistication of the service. In most cases, no, because as I said, it's multi-tenanted, and this is why you get some of the advantage of it in that it's cheaper and there's economies of scale and there's the ability to scale up and down your use. But what that does mean is that it's one single platform on which many users are working and accessing. So you can't require individual development to that platform. That's controlled very much by the cloud provider. And nor, of course, can you therefore own any developments that might be made during the time you're using it. There are some more sophisticated cloud solutions around CRM packages where you actually can do customization and configuration, but that's really on an interface basis. It's not to the actual platform. And again, in that scenario, depending on who is doing them for you, you may well own those.
Are service credits relevant in cloud arrangements?
Yeah, I mean, there is, again, it goes back to this point about it being a multi-tenanted environment, and sometimes, not all providers offer service levels and service credits. Some do, but they tend to be quite weak, and it's fairly rare that you get any service credits. And even where you do get service credits being offered, they're not really very meaningful. There's lots of carve-outs. So it doesn't, at the moment, have the level of importance that it might do in a normal traditional IT outsourcing agreement where everybody would be very much geared towards that service level and service credit regime. It's a fairly flimsy solution at the moment in most cloud agreements, which is why I made the point about having the right to terminate for convenience, so that if you're not happy with the quality of the service or the performance of the service, then you've got a right to exit and try something different.
Does the cloud have a silver lining? Is there a future out there for cloud?
It certainly is growing at a rapid rate, and there's lots of statistics around about how it increases productivity, how it's cost effective, all of that kind of good stuff. And again, lots of statistics around about how cloud providers themselves are growing, 90% year-on-year growth some are seeing. So it clearly is growing. There is some tension, though, about how many more businesses can utilise it because of this issue about whether they will give the necessary legal protection for businesses who are highly regulated, like financial services businesses. And clearly they need their cloud providers to enter into fairly onerous terms around security and data protection to comply with their own requirements by someone like the Financial Services Authority. And there's lots of debate at the moment about whether that will open up and cloud providers will negotiate a little bit more on these terms. Personally, I don't think they will, because I think they're in that space now where they're used to excluding liability and taking little contractual risk. But there are commentators who think they will have to do more here in order to get more businesses using the service.
As an in-house lawyer about to enter into a cloud agreement, what is the key issue I should keep at the front of my mind?
The main thing for me is absolutely understanding what it is you're buying. So as a lawyer, before you actually start looking at any of the terms and conditions, you need to dive back into your business, talk to your technical people, understand absolutely how it works, where data is going, where all the disaster recovery stuff is dealt with, where the data centre is, get a real feel for the structure of the service. And then if you aren't being offered the commitment around data protection and other regulatory issues, make that assessment on day one as to whether this service is going to offer you the necessary level of security protection or not. Because if it isn't, and you can't get it from the cloud provider, there is no point in even starting down the path of negotiating that contract. And that's where a lot of the frustration is arising, that people are deciding to use the service, going into the negotiation, and only in the last moment realising that actually it's not a service that will work for them. You save a huge amount of time by doing all of that due diligence up front. And that would be my key piece of advice, I think, on these sorts of agreements.